when we look at VO2 max as a definition, it is the maximum amount of oxygen consumed during exercise or training. If the one individual has a high VO2 max, he will outperform another athlete who has a lower VO2 max. It helps with reduction in body fat percentage. It helps with your longevity of life. Also decreases your chances of getting cardiovascular disease later on. You can train as hard as you want. You might actually be overreaching, and that might also be a reason why you're not improving your times or improving the goals that you would like.
Welcome to smulcast, where we explore the intersection between wellness, health, and fitness with leading experts. Today we are talking about VO2 Max and its extreme importance in our everyday lives. Now, what is VO2 Max and why is it important as a measure of our cardiovascular health and fitness? To answer all our questions, we are joined by Dr. Shaundré Jacobs. She's a lecturer at the University of Stellenbosch and she also holds a PhD. Welcome, Dr. Jacobs. Please tell us who you are and why you are interested in this field of sports.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. I'm a senior lecturer at Stellenbosch University. Next year I'll be 10 years at the department, so I enjoy my work quite thoroughly. I lecture undergrad as well as postgrad at the University of Stellenbosch in the Faculty of Medicine. My field of expertise is more strength and conditioning and fitness. In the undergrad, it's more for health and wellness in terms of the general population. And then in the postgraduate honors degree in performance sport, I teach my students how to work with elite athletes in all the different biomotor abilities to prepare them for team sports as well as individual sports. Then besides my job, I'm also the co-organizer of Silly Shakeout with two of my fellow colleagues. And then I'm also an avid trail runner that I love running in the mountains.
Wonderful. So can we start off by you please explaining to us what VO2 Max is and why it is such an important measure for athletes but also for the public in general?
So firstly, we need to understand what aerobic capacity is. And aerobic capacity is the body's ability to use fuel as energy in the presence of oxygen. And if we understand this, we are able to create certain specific training programs that is aimed at certain energy systems. So when we look at VO2 max as a definition, it is the maximum amount of oxygen consumed during exercise or training. The V stands for volume and the O2 stands for oxygen. So when we look at VO2 max in general, there's different training types that you can utilize to be able to stimulate VO2 max, and then there's the interval training that you can actually do to enhance the training performance. So why is VO2 max important is if you have a situation where there are two different individuals, if the one individual has a high VO2 max, he will outperform another athlete who has a lower VO2 max. And that is quite crucial in endurance sports, but it's also important in the daily lives of individuals in terms of their health and wellness. So if you have a higher VO2 max, it will help increase your quality of life. It will decrease your mortality rate, and it will also serve as a protective mechanism for cardiovascular disease or chronic diseases over time.
Thank you, and that is so important to understand that VO2 max is not just a term reserved for elite athletes. It's an important measure in everyday life, and everybody should have at least an idea of where they're at. And this brings me to my next question. So how then can our listeners go about to measure their VO2 max and to just practically see where they're at?
So there's a direct method and there's an indirect method. The direct method, I would assume that athletes will use it more because it's quite, it's a direct measurement of their VO2 max. You would normally go to a physio lab, or you will go to an exercise science lab. They will place a mask on the athlete's face and it will measure the amount of oxygen that the athlete is inhaling and the amount of carbon dioxide that they are exhaling. You would also take a heart rate measurement at the same time while you are doing your VO2 max. And then they will weigh the athlete their weight beforehand. So while you are doing this, depends on what type of exercise you normally do in your normal activity or your sport. You can either have a cyclogometer, or you can utilize a bicycle, or you can use a treadmill if running is your sport. Then you will utilize that mode. Then you will start off with a lower intensity, and then you will ramp up that intensity till the athlete reaches their max, and that will be your VO2 max measurement at the end of that test. So that's a direct measurement. Then you get indirect measurements, and that will mostly be where you will utilize a 2.4 kilometer Cooper test, or a 12-minute running test. You can also do a 1.5 mile run or walk test that you can also have an estimate of your VO2 max. Then if you look at different team sports, they will do a yo-yo intermittent test or a bleep test, but again, these are all estimates of your VO2 max. But I would like to emphasize that it's good to have an idea of what your VO2 max is so that you can identify it and then obviously adapt your training accordingly. There is a cost when you do it in the lab. So some people will either use their apps or try and get a sports scientist to do the field test, which is the indirect measurements.
Thank you. And like we have discussed earlier also before we started the podcast is, yes, it's important to know the VO2 max, but it's not so important to know the exact number for the general public. As long as you know what your baseline is, and then you will know when you are improving it. And this takes me to my next question. Why is it important to improve the VO2 max? And how does that translate then to better health or to improved outcomes with competitive sports?
So if you improve your VO2 max, you actually help the body be able to sustain certain muscle contractions for a longer period of time. So if you're looking at your endurance sports, this is quite important. So the aerobic capacity helps with the efficiency of the heart and lungs being able to supply oxygenated blood to the working muscle, and then also the muscle being able to extract that oxygen so that it can obviously do the running or the cycling, etc. So the higher your VO2 max becomes, it actually helps with the efficiency of that movement from your heart and your lungs to the working muscles. So that is quite important for performance athletes, and that's why we need to strive for a higher VO2, just for the efficiency of the movement. And then in terms of health, obviously, if you have a higher VO2 and you do a lot of aerobic training, it helps with reduction in body fat percentage. It helps with your longevity of life. It helps with movement efficiency, functional movement ability. Also decreases your chances of getting cardiovascular disease later on, some even strokes or maybe falls in the future. So it has health benefits as well as performance benefits.
Thanks for that, and I completely agree with you. When I speak to my patients and I tell them about VO2 max, obviously a much easier way of just talking to my general patients is to tell them it's the effective way how your heart can actually pump oxygen, and then your muscles can use it to produce energy from the protein, the carbohydrates and the fats. And that's important because for daily living, to do mundane activities like climbing stairs or taking my groceries from the car into the house, I need to have a VO2 max. And I know that they say this is one of the best predictors of longevity, to know what your baseline VO2 max is and then to increase it if possible. So what are some of the effective training methods, how someone can actually improve their VO2 max? And is there a specifically structured way of doing it, or is it just by jumping on my bike and going for the fastest ride I can?
Yeah, I think that's probably the worst that you can do, but a lot of people do that.
Yes.
A lot of people enter into what I call panic training, because especially when a 2 Oceans is coming up or a marathon, then everyone starts jumping into interval training. So it is one form. The first, I'll mention the top 3, and then also in the level of occurrence that you need to do it. So when you're starting out with aerobic training, I would suggest that you start off with LSD. This is your steady state type of training, long, slow distance. And you're basically running for longer durations, but at a slow to moderate intensity.
And that's sometimes difficult for athletes.
Yep.
To understand that, because they just want to go at peak pace.
At a high intensity. Yes. So I normally advise, if you can do the talking test, which is have a conversation with a friend while you are doing your run or your ride, then you know you are in a lower intensity. If you are starting to be out of breath, then you are obviously going into a different zone. So when we look at heart rate zones, I would prescribe with LSD to rather be in your zone 1, zone 2, and maybe zone 3, depending depending on the level of the athlete or client. But it's basically to build a nice aerobic base. There's also been research that has shown that if you have a good aerobic base in terms of LSD, that you decrease your amount of injuries that you could get later on. So it's quite a beneficial factor and a good foundation that can be built as well. Then we have your pace and tempo type of training. This is where you're training at your lactate threshold, and this is a little bit harder than your LSD. It ranges from maybe 90 seconds to a minute to 2 minutes to 5 minutes. I call it your sweet spot type of intervals. You get into a gear and you hold that gear for as long as you can.
Max effort?
No, it's basically zone 3 and zone 4. So you must be able to hold it for a longer period of time. So if you're in zone 5 at your max, you're not going to be able to hold it. What's nice about pace and tempo, it helps the muscles be able to clear the lactate more efficiently. And obviously if you're running a 10K or a marathon, it helps you to run a certain pace. So if your goal is to run 5:35 average, then it helps you maintain that pace for a longer period of time. And if you had the aerobic base of LSD, it's a nice step up into the pace and tempo. Then the third one would be your interval training. That is the one that's going to help you push and increase your VO2 max. But a lot of people, when they start cardiovascular training, they immediately jump into interval training and then they get injuries. Too much too soon leads to injuries. So I would prescribe that you start off LSD, pace and tempo, and then you go to your interval training. So what is interval training? It is alternated periods of high intensity, but shorter, interspersed with longer periods of lower intensities. When we're talking about the high intensity, you're talking about 90 to 100% of your maximum heart rate, and you at your VO2 max, because you need to push above that. And then your lower intensities is basically just for recovery. And again, it ranges between 30 seconds, 1 minute, 5 minutes. For me, the most important is looking at your work to rest ratio. So if you have a 1-to-1, which is for every 1 minute of work, you need to rest for 1 minute. So you can work 1-to-2, 1-to-3, and some people even work at a 1-to-5, depending on the level of the intensity. So it's a really effective method, but I would like to tell the listeners you will feel DOMS, which is called delayed onset of muscle soreness. Some people call it delayed onslaught of muscle soreness, but I think you just need to push through, and it's really going to help you improve your times and get better in endurance sports.
Shaundré, you mentioned the zones of training. Can you just explain to the listener what you mean by zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, please?
Yeah. So firstly, zone 1 would be more recovery type of activities that you would do, going for easy run. Sometimes before your race, you will do what we call a taper run. A lot of people are running 4-minute K for their taper run. That's not zone 1. That's a high intensity. Then your zone 2 will range between you can still have a conversation, but it's not that you're running at a high intensity. 3 would be mostly your LSD types of trainings that I spoke about earlier. So you're able to have a conversation, but it's not that intense. Zone 4 will be a little bit more strenuous. That's when you're targeting your pace and tempo. And zone 5, it's almost race pace. You can't have a conversation at all. I don't want to go into the particulars of beats per minute because depending on the fitness of an athlete, my specific beats per minute will be different from yours.
It's age and sex specific, and obviously
one way that you can work out your maximum heart rate is indirect way is taking 220 minus age, and then you can get your maximum heart rate. But in terms of the zones, it will be dependent on the individual. If you do your VO2 max testing, they give you a breakdown of where your specific zones will be. I know a lot of people have Garmin apps or different watches, and they also give you an estimate of the various zones as well. So you can work within that. I like to work in a specific range and not give a direct heart rate to an athlete to say you need to now be at 175 beats per minute, because that varies based on the terrain or the undulating nature.
How stressed you are on that
exactly.
day, yes.
So if you don't have a watch that can give you that, just give them a range or do an indirect measurement as well.
I want to ask a question just for practical purposes. For somebody just starting out that want to try this interval training now, and you said a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2, how would they decide if they need 2-minute rest or 1-minute rest or 4-minute rest? How would they clinically or practically implement that?
Yeah. A normal method, if you're starting out and you don't know about heart rate or resting, I would say that wait for your heart rate to come back to baseline.
Okay.
Because then you know, okay, I'm feeling much better now, I'm at a resting state, and now I can push again in terms of getting that high intensity. I always say if you work at 100% intensity, you need to get 100% rest so that you can perform that 100 intensity more than one time. So it's maybe just identifying when I'm going back to base and then be able to push again.
And how many of those rounds would you then suggest for somebody starting out?
I'll say quality over quantity.
Okay.
So even if you have to start off with 4 to 5 repetition of quality, it also depends on the duration. If I'm doing a 5-minute interval, I'm not going to be able to do 5 of them. I'll probably do 3 quality ones. So it depends on when you're starting off. I would say start off modest, not be too ambitious with a longer duration. Also, if you're looking at the intensity, it needs to match your ability as an athlete as well. So maybe starting with 30 seconds and then 40 seconds and increasing that to a minute and then seeing how you feel. The fitter you are, you'll see that you get back to a resting state quicker. So normally I look at the breathing of the athletes in terms of if they are ready for the next repetition.
Definitely, thank you. That's quite practical. And as you mentioned, that resting is important, not just resting in the session, but also resting after having had a strenuous session. Because if you overtrain yourself day by day by day, then obviously you will cause more damage than actually good.
Yeah.
So we have touched on some of them, but let's go a little bit deeper into what are some of the physiological changes that occur in the body by increasing the VO2 max and why it is so extremely beneficial.
So the first one is what I mentioned earlier with regards to the heart, the functioning of the heart as well as the lungs in terms of the efficiency of the movement. So you feel that the organs are working better in terms of just supplying oxygenated blood to the working muscles and the extraction thereof. So that is that feeling of competency when you are doing your aerobic training. The next one will be your increase in mitochondria, which is called the powerhouse of the cell. And obviously you want to increase that so that you can
You want a lot of
enhance.
ATP production. That's the energy source of the body.
Yeah, 100%. And then obviously hemoglobin. If you have a high increase of hemoglobin, you will aid in the transportation of that oxygen. So those are some of the physiological adaptations that can help with VO2 max training.
Definitely. And as we've alluded to earlier, yes, for athletes that's extremely important, but also for the general public.
Yeah, 100%.
Because when I'm 90 years old, I still want to be able to climb the stairs unassisted. So, Shaundré, are there individual factors that can influence a person's VO2 max, and what can they do to improve it?
So the first one is your age. As we get older, your VO2 max decreases. This is why it's so important that we need to do cardiovascular training so that we can keep increasing our VO2 max levels. And this just happened naturally because of age. And there is something we can do. So we have to try and train as much as we can in terms of the aerobic conditioning. Then there's also the gender factor. So I always say that we need to look at the context. The context is quite important. So when we are comparing apples to apples, and if we have elite men and elite women, elite men will have a higher VO2 max compared to elite women. And that is because they have more muscle mass, which means they have obviously more an efficiency in terms of the muscles and the oxygen, etc. So we have to keep that in mind. But then if we have a context that we compare apples with pears, an elite woman will have a higher VO2 max compared to a recreational man because of she having a higher muscle mass and therefore a higher VO2. So those are the type of factors that we need to keep in mind. Another one would be your training status. When you start off with a novice client, they will have they will respond quicker to a training program compared to a seasoned athlete. So normally we say it takes about 4 to 6 weeks for adaptations to occur. This is the minimum requirement. But you have responders versus non-responders, or people that can respond to a training program quicker than the other. So it's quite important to keep that in mind. And then you have your seasoned athletes. They need a specific response. So you need to focus on the intensity of the workouts and how that affects the different individuals. And then your training plateaus. I think a lot of people underestimate the power of variety, not just staying with one aerobic training program, but bringing in various other elements. You can start off with LSD, but you can train LSD at the same time while you are doing interval training. So we speak about a micro plan. Most athletes do their long runs on the weekend because they have more time available. If you have a flexible job and you can do a 2-hour, 3-hour run in the week, that's great for you. Yes. But mostly we do long runs on the weekend because of time availability. Then in the week you'll structure it with your interval training or even your pace and tempo. And then you have your resistance training that comes in as well. So try and keep your programs spiced up, not just focusing on one aspect, but integrating them all. But you must be a master of them first before you get into that.
Definitely. And I love also that you mentioned for people to realize that this takes time. So don't feel discouraged that you've started this new program and after 2 weeks there's no improvement or there's just a slight improvement. Keep at it. Like you said, it takes about 4 to 6 weeks for the body to adjust and then set a new goal and set a new goal. Is there specific limits or end values where somebody knows I've reached my peak level now, I will not be able to go any further or get any better? How would they know that?
You have to do testing. So by doing testing in terms of your VO2 max, but you can also do other cardiovascular tests, other strength tests in order just to see what your adaptations are on your baseline scores. A lot of athletes in aerobic sports, they would do time trials, whether it's on the bike or if it's running. Then you compare yourself to yourself over time. I think people should not be discouraged by hitting a ceiling. We have physiological limitations, so we need to incrementally build the intensity and the load so that we can break through. And then obviously you'll get to a spot where you are stagnant in terms of your performance or how you are doing in your racing, and then you need to increase. But what a lot of people forget is that the harder you train, the more you need to recover. Yes. So recovery is key to making those adaptations. You can train as hard as you want. You might actually be overreaching, and that might also be a reason why you're not improving your times or improving the goals that you would like. So train hard, but there needs to be a nice balance between hard training and recovery as well.
Thank you for that. And that is really such valuable insight. And this takes us to the next question. We've covered a lot of this, but maybe just keep it extremely practical. What practical tips do you have for somebody that from Monday they want to start to improve their VO2 max? How would they go about doing that?
Yeah. So start off with the basics first. Get the LSD. A lot of people don't like LSD. I'm a trail runner, so I go in the mountain and it's quite therapeutic, nature bathing. But I know there are some road runners out there as well, and road cyclists and mountain bikers. But start off with LSD. If you get a good foundation, it's like building a house. You need to have a strong foundation, and then you can build the walls and the windows, etc. Start off with LSD. Once you get your adaptations over there, you maintain the LSD, but now you can have an add-on of your pace and tempo. You get to increase your pace. You now start feeling like, okay, I can run a little bit faster than I used to, and now you're improving your performance over there. Then later on, you can bring your interval training, still keeping the base, because my philosophy in program design is what you don't train, you lose. So you need to be able to keep those adaptations, and then you get into your interval training. The biggest mistake that a lot of people make in interval training is they jump immediately into it, and that is where they get muscle strains and muscle tears. So I would say start off small and then slowly increase the intensity in the workout. We also have an inverse relationship between the repetitions as well as the intensity. If you're increasing the intensity, you cannot increase the volume, which is the reps and the sets. if you increase the reps and the sets, your intensity needs to come down. So there needs to be that inverse relationship. And then another tip that I would give is monitor your performance. There's various apps that you have. Monitor your mileage, monitor your heart rate. Heart rate tells you so much about your performance and how you're adapting to a training program. However, we need to be careful because heart rate is also influenced by stress. It's influenced by if you're getting sick, a cold, caffeine, what you're eating, etc. So you can take it, but there's heart rate variability, obviously. But track your performance. There's various apps, Garmin, Strava, just to be able to see how you are doing, and then obviously do your testing as well. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm a firm believer in train hard, recover harder. Yes. You need to be able to recover from a stimulus. We have a nice graph where it shows you work hard, and then you need to basically, the body's starting to break down. So you need to increase the recovery so that you can work even more harder than you did before. If you don't, and you just go on a negative spiral, you're going to actually have a negative performance.
Exactly. There's a saying that being fit doesn't mean being healthy, and being healthy doesn't necessarily mean being fit. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very important for the listeners also to understand that just because somebody can run a marathon in a certain amount of time does not mean that they are extremely healthy. Yeah. They might be completely overtrained or completely overworked. So thank you, Shaundré, for having such an insightful discussion with us today on VO2 Max. And as you could see from today, that VO2 Max is not just an important measure for elite athletes, but also for everyday life. Thanks for tuning in, and we cannot wait to see you on our next smulcast.